What are we
Welcome
going to
to
cover?
the
Oh, sorry.
T.A.C. show. Today, our guest, Mike Sigler. So, Mike, were you born? So, you weren't born in New York, right?
I was not. I was born in a little town called Boonton, New Jersey, which is down near Sparta, New Jersey, where I grew up. So it was about 20 minutes away.
Was it like near the city, New Jersey, like near the borders of New York and New Jersey? Was it more central?
No, it's northern New York, where Taylor ham is actually Taylor ham and not pork roll. It's a where you root for the Giants, basically. So yeah, Sussex County is where Sparta is. Morris County, I think, is Boonton. So yeah, all about 45 minutes out of New York City.
How did you get your start out in New York? And
So I was working in Boston as a writer and got offered my first on-air television job in upstate New York. So went to Elmira, worked for WENY TV for about a year, went up to Syracuse to work there for a few years, went back to Elmira and worked for WETM as a reporter anchor until I decided to run for New York State Assembly, which I lost in 2002. But I lived in Ithaca and then moved to Lansing and ran for county legislature and have won that race the first time, lost it I think the second time, then won it the third time, and won it the fourth time. So
super interesting. So how did you get your start on the pilot? Like, what was your military career like?
I wasn't in the military at all. My pilot's license?
Oh yeah.
No, what were you asking about? I'm sorry, Tom.
How did you get your pilot's license?
Yeah, no, I wasn't in the military. I had always wanted to fly. I tried to get into. I applied for the military when I was like 18. They were not going to take me on as a pilot at that point. My eyes were bad, and I think for the one branch, I think the other branch, my grades weren't good enough. I forget, but so I didn't go that route. Decided to go into journalism instead. But then when I was about 45, I was going through some life things and said, I really want to invest my time in that. It's something I always wanted to do. East Hill Flying Club is right here in, it's in Lansing, New York at the airport, but, Ithaca too, we put that name on it as well. You can go up there and take lessons. I started doing that. And about 2 years later, I had my pilot's license. I had to go for check rides and all that. So.
How many hours worth of lessons do you need to become a pilot and get a license?
So they tell you the minimum, I think, is like 40. Yeah, nobody does it in 40 really, unless your mom or dad is a pilot and you're flying with them a lot and you kind of get those early lessons. 40 is pretty tough. Most people, I think, do it in about 65 on average. It takes a little longer if you're doing it kind of piecemeal like I did. So it took me about 107 hours. But that was because I stretched it out over 2 years. If you're going to go get your private pilots, I would suggest you try to do it as quickly almost as possible. You really want to pack it into the shortest period of time possible so you don't lose anything while you're sitting on the ground.
In your pilot career, like, what's the longest flight you've ever done?
So the longest flight I've done was actually out to Hampton, New Hampshire. So I don't make any money doing this. It's not like I wouldn't mind it being a career, but it's not one for me. But so it's all out of pocket. But I flew from Ithaca and I flew out to Hampton, New Hampshire, which is right on the coast, which is about 3 hours. And nice little airport, great little diner there. I flew out because Sarah was out there with the girls. My wife was out there with the girls and I met them. They picked me up. We went to the beach for the day. I stayed overnight and then I took off in the morning and flew back to Ithaca. So what would amount to about an 8-hour drive was only like a 2.5 to 3 hour flight. So it was kind of neat.
Yeah, have you ever done any crazy barrel rolls or any cool flight moves or anything like that?
I am not approved to do that. And I'm never in a plane that can actually do that. But I saw a guy in Cortland doing that and he apparently teaches lessons. So I'm going to go check that out. But now I have some friends that do those kind of things. You need a special plane and you actually, you need a sign off to do acrobatics. So.
Yeah, what's the steering wheel like? Like, is it like a car steering wheel or?
No, I guess it looks similar. It's a yoke, so it looks kind of like this. And then you have your hands there. The older time ones are more like a circle. They're like kind of an odd egg, like an egg that's been sat on the table too long. But the difference is in a steering, like in a car, when you go a certain direction, you're putting force on the wheel, which is making you go a certain direction. Whereas in an aircraft, you have what's called ailerons on the wing, and they are tilting you this way or that way, and they're forcing lift in a different direction. So it's those ailerons that are making you turn. And then you have a rudder in the back, which you're using your feet on, and that's kind of keeping the plane, it's keeping the tail from going into a skid or something like that. You're trying to keep the plane straight, so it's comfortable to fly in too. And it's called coordinated flight. So that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Would you recommend the film Airplane as an educational film for flight students?
Maybe not as educational, but certainly some of the lines in there you can certainly use and have been in many flight things. So
is it recommended when you have a flight into chaos that you just go and use a floaty to take over?
Exactly right. Just you watch this. Actually, some of the big planes like that now really do kind of fly themselves. The key part is the landing and the takeoff. But when you're in the air, if you have a good autopilot, it'll hold your altitude. It'll hold your track. I mean, it does quite a bit for you, especially with the new planes. Now they've come out with a plane that will actually land itself. I don't know if that's ever going to be in high use for people. Maybe one day. I mean, you're having autonomous cars, and I never thought that was probably going to happen. But pretty soon, autonomous planes, right? You've got drones that are already capable of doing that, so it's not out of the question.
Yeah. So you also had a journalist career?
I did. I started out when I went to college. I went to Northeastern in Boston. I went there for 5 years. It was a co-op school. So you would go to school for 2 months and then they would place you into a job. So, from there I worked at the Patriot Ledger, which was a newspaper. Then I went to work for a magazine. Then I went and started working in television, and I liked television. So I kind of stayed there. I worked for CNBC. And then when I was at CNBC, I decided to go for my master's. I went to Columbia Journalism School, which is in Manhattan. And stayed there for 2 years. I was in a part-time program. So I was working freelance at CNN, worked as a writer, Good Morning America. That was good. So did a lot of freelance work there. And then when I graduated, I started looking for on-air jobs. Took a writing job in Boston because I knew Boston, and I figured better to have a job writing in a major city than kind of sitting around doing nothing while you wait for your on-air career to take off. So that's what I did.
Was there like anybody who inspired you for journalism? People like Bob Woodruff, Carl Bernstein, anybody like that?
I had a teacher who told me I couldn't write, and I took that as a challenge. So then I just started writing a lot more. In hindsight, would I have gone into journalism again, knowing what I know today? I don't know. It was a fun career. It was definitely a career for younger people, I think, until you get to a certain level. I don't know if you could really do it the way I did it back then, because you really need, until you're not going to start making money now. If you want to have a family and things like that, you're probably not going to start making real money until you're in like a top 30 market. And that's, but then again, nowadays, if you have some talent, you can start in a market 70. You can start. And when I was leaving the business too, you could actually start in a Syracuse. We had interns that got hired to be on-air reporters. So that was a big change. You never had that in the past. And then, everybody wants to be on TV, right? So there's a constant stream of people who want to be on TV, and reporting is a good way to do that, I guess. So,
Really?
but no, I did not have any, wow, that's the guy I want to be. I wanted to make a difference, right? I wanted to report on things. And that's kind of why I eventually went into politics. I got tired of reporting on people making a difference and thought, listen, I can do their job, maybe better than they can. So why don't I go and run for the office and be the person that makes the change, as opposed to being the person who reports on the person making the change, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Like, did you learn anything important through journalism school, or anything that helped you out throughout life?
I learned a lot, actually, in journalism school. I learned how to, I guess, be pithy, if that makes any sense. How to organize your thoughts and present them to people so that they understand what you're talking about. I used to report on all kinds of things. I used to report on like nuclear accelerators. I did a 2-part series on that. Medical and stock trades. I mean, I have a pretty wide breadth of knowledge now at this point in my life about kind of like how the world works. And the great thing about being a journalist, so I don't mean to be negative. I'm just saying that, be prepared to not get paid very much money in the early days. And frankly, you don't even need, look what you're doing, right? You're out there, you're putting out a YouTube show. You don't actually need a station anymore to be a reporter. I mean, some of my favorite reporters are now on different websites where you go and you kind of pay just to read them. And I like that. Granted, I'd rather read them in the newspaper, but that's no longer an avenue for them. So I'm going to read them someplace else. And it's the same idea with you. I mean, there's a lot of news out there that's not being covered. A lot of news in Lansing that's not being covered. And if somebody were to, figure out a way to monetize that, it's kind of like the Lansing Star. That was a great, local paper for 15 years. And Dan figured out a way to monetize that so we could make a living and do it. And there's a lot of towns like that. Even Ithaca, right? Town of 30,000 people. You've got, a major international university. You've got 2 other colleges. You've got a lot going on there. And yeah, I mean, it's an open market really for television or for a YouTube show, for example. I mean, who would have thought you would go and be able to pick the news station you want off of YouTube? And that's where we are today.
Have you, like, working at those as a freelancer, did you ever meet anybody like Ron Burgundy? Anybody who just read the lines off? And
that would have been great if I met Ron Burgundy. But funny, I mean, obviously you meet people. It's funny. I used to work with David Muir. David Muir is now the lead anchor, really, of the nation. He's the most watched news person in the country. Does ABC news at 6 o'clock, right from Syracuse. He just bought a house, I think, in Skinny Atlas. Obviously, he doesn't live there during the week, but I think weekends or whatever. And yeah, I used to work with him up in Syracuse, and that was kind of where he started. And people really, he was great. I mean, he was probably the best on-air person I ever had met. And it's neat. You meet people through the business who then go on to do things in much larger markets. So yeah, I mean, I definitely, Lou Dobbs, he just got fired from Fox, but I remember working for him when I was in New York City, and that was headline news, and that was 25 years ago, right? Or Stuart Varney, I used to work for him. And my friend Matt, he's a producer at Squawk Box, and he's married to the anchor at Squawk Box. So I know both of them. So yeah, I mean, you definitely meet interesting people, but the most interesting people you meet really are the famous people. It's the stories you go on. One of the best stories I ever went on was they flew the Fuddy Duddy, which is a B-52 bomber, into Elmira. And I was able to get on that plane and fly around on that plane as part of the news story. And it was neat because there was a local, that story in itself is neat, right? But the bomb sites for that plane in World War II were made right in Elmira. And I'm talking to people that were on the tarmac and they're going to go up on it. I'm talking to this woman. She's like, yeah, my husband used to fly. He was a bombardier in this aircraft in World War II. I go, wow, that's really interesting. So I'm talking to her and she's like, and I used to work at the bomb site factory right here in Elmira. So that's my story, right? The woman making the bomb site for this plane, her husband is using that bomb site to fight World War II. I mean, that's a great story, right, from anybody. And those are the kind of stories that's really why journalism is a great thing. You get to meet so many different people, and you meet them in good circumstances and really at their worst circumstances, right? Whether it be a car accident or somebody fighting cancer or name it, that's you're going to meet a lot of different people in a lot of different situations, and you really get to learn the human condition. And that's kind of why we're all here, right? Is to meet other people, to know them. I mean, what's the point of life that's why I think this pandemic's been so difficult. It's really separated us as a people. And I think as soon as that we can figure out how to get past that and get back to being one people, I think we'll be much better off.
It can't be that bad. People had to deal with a 300-year pandemic a few hundred years ago. People complaining about 1 year of this. Imagine spending 5 generations of living it with no signs of progression.
Oh, are you talking like the Black Plague?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, think about that. That wiped out a third of the population of the world. But then again, people were further apart. You didn't have, I think your village had to survive. If your village wasn't surviving, you probably weren't surviving. So you definitely, I think, had to lean on people a little bit more than maybe you do today. I mean, we were already isolated, right, as people. If you went around, and this comes into politics too. People say, "Oh, I really wish I was more connected to my community." I go, "Well, you should run for public office because." How many people can honestly say, "Oh, I know my neighbor really well," or "Oh, I know the guy down the street." A lot of people don't know their neighbors. A lot of people, you miss that bumping into people at church or bumping into people at the store with this pandemic. Whereas I don't know if you had that leniency during the Black Plague. You really were kind of more in it altogether because that really was wiping out whole towns and villages and things like that. So.
Yeah. Do you feel that American news these days is more like biased on both terms compared to British news?
I do. I do. And bias, I'm not sure. People act like, well, that news is reported in a certain way, and that's the bias. And that's not really the main problem I have with it. It goes back to more like story choice. Um, I'm looking at stories that are in the news, and I'm going, I can't understand why this is a news story. Like, I don't even understand why you're reporting on this. And yet, that's the news of the day, and that's the thing that gets the most clicks, right, from people because they go, "Wow, that's interesting." Like Army Hammer, I don't even know who that is, and yet he's being accused of like cannibalism or something, and I'm like, "Pardon? Well, I don't really understand what you're talking about." And now they're going into, "Well, this person had a bruise back in such and such a year," and I'm like, "Wow, this is all very complicated news about some person I've never even heard of." Or it's like when you read, "Oh, so and so broke up," and I'm like, I don't know either one of those people. And I'm not really understanding their breakup. They were boyfriend, girlfriend. Like, why is that in my news? I don't understand. And yet, you read about things like if you were to say, well, Germany's COVID-19 problem is pretty severe, people would go, "What do you mean? COVID? They're doing great with COVID." I'm like, no, actually, their situation is almost as bad as America's, and people they're blindsided by that news. And I think that's why people do get blindsided, because I don't think the news really reports kind of what's going on almost in the world sometimes. People were shocked that, President Trump won in 2016. And it's like, if you had been listening to the news, yeah, I guess that would be shocking because everybody thought he was going to lose, right? But if you were listening to, if the news reporters had gone out and really talked to some of these states, maybe they would have had a better handle on what was going on and been like, yeah, no, we're pretty sure this is going to be a really close race. But people were like, "Oh my God, I can't believe what happened." So it's not really Mike Sigler saying, "Well, the news is biased." I don't even think biased might be the right word. I just think they're not doing the job. It seems like they've checked out. I don't really know why. There are some stories out there that are just so interesting. I'm like, how did you not cover this? And then they say, "Well, that was a regional story," or, "Oh, that was just a city story." I go, "Really?" Because it's really interesting. There was a state senator, I always use this example. There was a state senator out in California, in a place that I've probably been there, but I don't know much about the area. And he was just a state senator. So, like our state senators, not federal, state level, but he was running guns out of his office, literally buying guns in like Mexico, running them and selling them out of his office. And I'm like, CNN, they said, "Oh no, that was a regional story." I'm like, really? Because that's really interesting. Like, I don't know. I would pay attention to that story. And how deep does that go? Whatever happened to that story? These are all questions I have.
Yeah,
So.
that become viral these days. If somebody just
Right?
like that on their phone, they probably get a few million views.
Right.
Do you think that social media should be considered news agencies, since basically anybody can upload anything and share stuff? But I don't think it could be accurate, since like anybody can give their own interpretation of the news. And
Well, I think there's two things you've got to remember, right, on social media. If you read something that fits too closely with your worldview, you might want to double check that, right? Like I read something the other day and I'm like, yeah, that guy's right. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. And then I read, I'm like, oh yeah, that story's false. Because it fit too closely with what I believe. So I'm like, yeah, that's probably not right. And I think more people should do that because then they cross-post it or they, like Andrea Mitchell the other day called out Tom Cruise, or not Tom Cruise, Ted Cruz. I said, well, Ted Cruz, he misused this quote. He said it was Shakespeare, and it wasn't. It was Faulkner. And I'm like, I don't know, but that's the kind of thing I would think you. Ted Cruz is a pretty smart guy. I would want to double check that before I tweeted, but nope. She tweeted it out, and then this other reporter, oh, you go, yeah, you're right. You called him out, and it's like, no, he was right all along. But by the time that circles around, it's hit 36,000 people retweeting it. And why is Twitter even a thing? I don't even understand why that's so popular. It's not a great platform, but it is. So now I think what social media has to do is it has to decide, right? Are we the public square, which is what they claim to be? If you're the public square, yeah, then there's really not much that you should not be allowed to say on those social media platforms, right? Buyer beware. If you read a story and you're like, yeah, that doesn't actually sound right. And usually it's, about something that's not all that important to your life anyway. But fine, maybe it doesn't comport to what you think or whatever. Then yeah, look it up in a second, double source it. I mean, even when I was a reporter, if you heard, that's the other thing that's happened with journalism. Now they report anonymous sources. That's fine, but they don't even double source it. You used to do that. Like, okay, I heard this. Now I'm going to go find somebody else who says the same thing so that I'm not reporting garbage. Yeah, now people want to be first so bad that they'll throw out the garbage and later maybe print a retraction. But by that point, that's the narrative. That's what's believed. And that's where I think journalism has really fallen down, is there's no accountability when somebody gets anything wrong. Like, I don't know, if somebody told me something and I reported on it and I find out later that person was lying to me, I would out that person. I would say, this person told me this. They lied to me. And that's why this story is incorrect. But they don't do that. They want to protect that person. And I don't know why. If somebody's feeding you, a line, why protect that person? They're not a good source. They're not helpful to you as a journalist at all. Maybe they're helpful to you from a personal relation standpoint. But I remember going to Columbia Journalism School. One of the first things the dean said at that point was, yeah, you're not going to have a lot of friends. I mean, because everybody's a potential story. And frankly, in government, you're not going to really have any friends because you're trying to hold those people accountable. So be careful of who your friendships are, because you may have to burn those friendships, and that's going to be painful. And be aware of that. So, yeah, I don't think journalists maybe do that anymore. It doesn't seem like that.
Yeah. That's quite interesting. So, did anybody inspire you for politics, or was there any figures you know of that wanted you to break out into politics at all?
My family was not terribly. My parents weren't. My sister was pretty political. My brother's not. No, I mean, it's always been an interest. I mean, I was on student council when I was in high school, and that's the thing I tell people now. It's like colleges, right? I was talking to people in colleges, in a college the other day up at Cornell, and they were like, yeah, we want to run for student council at Cornell and stuff. And I said, be frank with you, you're 18. You can run for town board right now. Right? Why not do that? I mean, why don't you actually run for a government position where you're going to represent, like Lansing, I represent 7,500 people. I mean, run for that and, see if you can win. I mean, then you'll get really good on the ground experience of how to run a campaign. What are the important issues to your town? I mean, that's the thing in Lansing. I think I do a pretty decent job with that is, I go around and I talk to people and people tell me this is my main concern. Like right now, I get a lot of, from Lansingville Road. They have a real traffic problem there. There were a lot of trucks running up and down that road. And the neighbors there have an issue with it. And I've talked to one of the main people there, told him kind of what he has to do. He wrote a letter today, which I responded to already, but it's nice. He's bringing in other people now to kind of fight the good fight. So what got me into politics? I think, I don't know if it was a person or more of an issue. It was, 9/11. The first office I ran for was state assembly, and that was in 2002. 9/11 had just happened. And, that affected me like it did, I think, everybody else. And I thought, I would rather be in a position where I can actually affect change in people's lives. if people have a problem, I'd like them to be able to come to me and I'll be able to do something for them as opposed to just reporting it and saying, oh, here, so-and-so, you're the assembly person, you take care of it. I got tired of kind of telling other people to take care of it. I wanted to be the one to take care of it. So it wasn't so much a person as a period in time, I think.
So your uncle was an Annie?
He was, yeah. My uncle Tom, my uncle Tom, he was a Broadway actor, and he was So in Broadway, you have what's on Broadway, but then you have an off-Broadway production that kind of travels around, and he was Rooster in that. And yeah, my uncle Tom, he was the national champion in junior ballroom dancing. So he was the junior champion. Like the teen champion, I guess it would be called. But yeah, he was a good ballroom dancer, good actor, I thought. I used to go to his shows, like went to Connecticut with my mom and went to Pennsylvania, because again, the show would move. And yeah, it was Rooster. It was good to go and see him to do that. So interesting guy. It's funny when people say they're an actor because they're always something else too, right? I'm an actor, and I wait tables over here. And, he was a ballroom dancer, would teach ballroom dancing, but also, lived a pretty great lifestyle. He passed away in 1985. Interesting time in our country's history, because a lot of technological advances. He had gone on the Queen Mary, over to Great Britain, flew back on the Concorde. Always thought that was very cool, and just lived just down the street from the Dakota where John Lennon used to live, and actually was killed. And my uncle was just down the street from when that happened. And I remember going in for Thanksgiving into the city, had dinner at his place, and looked at this enormous apartment. And that's where I finally found out about rent control. So I said, how are you affording this? And he's like, oh, well, you see that lamp? I said, yeah, I see the lamp. So the owner of the place lives out in California. It's a rent controlled building. And that lamp is why this place is, it's priced at some crazy low amount of money. And I said, and that's legal. He's like, yeah, oddly enough. And so if you ever hear people against rent control, that's why they're against it, because you're getting charged nothing for this apartment. So
how was he able to get the role in audition?
It's the same thing in television. You audition a lot, and it's like anything. It's like sales, right? Like I'm in sales now. The key to sales is you put out as many leads as humanly possible, and then follow up on those leads, and take care of those leads too. If you're fishing and you've put a worm on the hook and you leave it in the water, you got to pull up the hook every once in a while to see if the worm is still on it, right? So it's the same idea with leads. You got to be careful with them and take care of them. And it's the same thing, I think, with my Uncle Tom. Was he auditioned a lot. So that's why a waiting job is good. It's not usually during when you're auditioning, and you can usually work schedules out and things like that. Not a 9-to-5 job. And then you go audition as much as you can, and you do your research on what the role is about. You do your research on what maybe that particular director is looking for, and try to fit that with what they're looking for. And again, you can't take failure and internalize it too much, because you're going to fail a lot. You're going to learn a lot about rejection. You're going to put, like, if you wanted to go be a journalist, you're going to put out maybe 100 tapes, and you may not hear anything on any of them. And then you're going to put out another 100 tapes, and maybe you'll hear from one. And that's the kind of rejection you just have to be prepared for. Particularly in something that's so subjective like that, where you may not have the right eye color. Your hair, you may be 5 years too old, and you're not even 5 years too old for the role, but the person you're going to be acting, the other lead, might be, 5 years younger, and it's not a good match, and you've got to not internalize that. They're looking for something, and it really doesn't have maybe a lot to do with you, as opposed to what this idea they have in mind for, right? So that's how he got the role. Was he just literally went out there every day and auditioned, and he didn't internalize it, and he didn't take it personally. And once you're in a show, you really want to nurse those relationships too with your co-stars and the people running the camera and the script writer. And you want to make it so you're easy to get along with, really, and easy to work with, and be kind to people. And that's a life lesson, not just a how do you get roles lesson. If you're kind to people, people generally respond to that and will be kind to you. And that way, if there's a role coming up and they think, wow, Tom would be perfect for that role, I'm going to call him and tell him that he's up for that role. And I may even mention him to the director if they already have the role. And that's how things like that work, right? Is you want to be known as somebody who's affable and good to work with. And it makes people's lives easier as opposed to making everybody's life harder, right? That's the key to politics too, right? If you have a problem and I slam the door in your face, I'm probably not going to stay elected very long, right? So same idea. And that's how we got the role, was he just tried out and kept trying out. And eventually somebody saw something in him and said, yep, you're the guy.
How long do you have the role for? Do you have it for a short time or a long time?
It was a couple of years. The show went out on the road, so he would go city to city and just be on the road. So yeah, a couple of years.
Any crazy trips or anything crazy that happened at any of the locations?
No, I don't think anything too crazy, but he, like I said, world traveler, like just interesting to fly on the Concorde. I mean, you're flying, Mach 1 on a commercial jet that no longer flies. And, I was down in DC, we went to the Aerospace Museum, and there they have a Concorde. You're like, wow, yeah, this was a big deal back in the day. And it really was. I mean, the Concorde was a status symbol of the 80s. And so stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, obviously, and he was, the time back then, my Uncle Tom, he was, so he was a gay man out, not to my family until much later. My mother knew much sooner than I knew, obviously, but she eventually told me. And he, as a gay man in New York City, 1980s, the big concern then was AIDS. Nobody knew what AIDS was back then. It was this virus, people were getting sick. And sure enough, I mean, my uncle eventually did get sick. He died of pneumonia, but he had become infected with AIDS. And I remember at the time, there really still not a lot of information on that in 1985. I remember going to visit him in the hospital and my mother saying, listen, don't, you can hug him, that's fine. But if something were to happen, like if his needle were to come out of his arm, he was on an IV. If his IV comes out, the nurse has to take care of that. That's not something we can clean up or touch or anything like that. So, because again, they didn't know much about it, but we knew it was okay to hug people and things like that, but it didn't go much further past that in knowledge, certainly not what we know today. And it really, back in 85, was a death sentence. It was not we're going to put you on certain medications and you're going to recover from this. You basically didn't have an immune system. And that's why pneumonia, if it crept in, that's what killed you. So, yeah, just a difficult time, but certainly, and it's interesting when you think about people you lose in that way. I eventually went to Columbia, as I mentioned. And whenever I would drive in to go to Columbia, and I'm like, wow, I really miss my Uncle Tom, because this would be he would be very proud of me going to Columbia. I would also have been blocks from his house, not very far. And it would have been great, if he had been still around, that I would go to New York City and I could go to class and I could go visit him and we could go to dinner and a show. And because he really was one of those uncles he was kind. And I missed that in that. I really felt a great loss from his passing.
Yeah. That's too bad. It's true that there was a heavy stereotype associated with these days. People now know way more, and they realize it's just some random tourists from Africa who got bitten by monkeys who brought it to the United States.
Yeah, and it's interesting. They're still doing research on the origins of AIDS and how.
And then basically it got spread due to all the crazy nightclubs, which they used needles.
Well, it was more, needles, obviously, but unprotected sex. They just literally in the beginning didn't know how it was moving through populations, and that's why just it hit the gay community so hard in the beginning. And just really, it was a scary time. I mean, people did not know how it was being spread. And you know, that was the biggest problem with it. And was just, imagine that, living in a community where your friends are all dying, and you literally don't know what's, it's something's causing it, it's a virus, but you don't know how to deal with it, of what's going to be done to kind of stop it. So.
Like, are you a big sports guy? And
I don't know. I like random sports, I guess. Being in college, I rode crew for Northeastern. That was great. And I miss it, and I just keep meaning to go back to it. And I just haven't yet. So maybe this spring, that'll be something I go back to. But it's a great sport. If anybody ever wanted to get into something, crew is great, teamwork, all that kind of thing. And it's a beautiful sport too. But no, I like football. I like baseball. Didn't like the shortened seasons, so it kind of took a year off. But we like the Yankees in this household. We like to go watch Yankees games when we can. It's the only reason I have DirecTV is to watch Yankees baseball. And football, some of the stories I liked football more than I do today. But I watched the Super Bowl a little bit. I like Tom Brady because I think he's an interesting story. That you go and from winning 6 rings, and you go to this brand new team, and in a year, boom, you're winning the Super Bowl again. That's an amazing story. So I think that's kind of the thing I like about sports is sometimes when people overcome something, and granted, he didn't really overcome something. I mean, he has great talent, obviously. He's the GOAT, right? But you read other stories about people overcoming tragedy or overcoming, really get set back in what they want to do, and they overcome it. And I think that's the brilliance of sports. I don't think there's anybody that hasn't watched, Miracle on Ice and went, wow, what a time that was to win that game against the Russians, the best team in the country at the height of the Cold War. I mean, you've got all the elements there flowing together, right? So, and I think that's the key to sports. And it doesn't really matter what sport. I think that's the beauty of it.
Were you shocked when Magic Johnson got AIDS and stuff? Like, were you much of a basketball person back then?
I wasn't, but I mean, obviously Magic Johnson, he was one of the biggest names in sports back then. And yeah, I mean, that was shocking. It was shocking because he was one of the first really such a well-known name. And for him and that took a lot of bravery on his part to frankly come out and say, yeah, this is what it is. It's not, he didn't make it into something else. He said, no, this is what it is, and heterosexual male, not, outside of the group that traditionally was thought to be coming down with this disease. So I think that really was a sea change in the way people kind of looked at the disease. Because if Magic Johnson could get it, they go, well, yeah, I mean, that's really anybody can get it. And, and he explained why he got it, and, unprotected, I think, sex. And I think that was what it was. And he went not all the way and described everything in detail, obviously, but made it clear that, yeah, this was something that I'm going to have to deal with the rest of, and still, he dealt with it. It's amazing where drugs are today, right? For somebody to survive like that. Whereas, 10 years before that probably would not have happened. So yeah, I think that was a sea change in the way people looked at the disease.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now these days, one guy actually got cured, medicine to like control it way easier. It's so shocking and so interesting.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, the cure thing, you would think that I know they're still studying what happened there. So I'm not going to go, I don't know that much about that. But again, it's like, double check all the news because that seems shocking. And that seems like that would be a world revelation because the AIDS virus, the reason that it's so dangerous is it mutates so quickly. And it's similar in that way to like herpes, right? Herpes you can't cure it. You have it for life. So that's where, medical fields, they look at diseases like that and say, okay, if we can beat this disease, then we can build, it has implications for other diseases. So that's why we are making advances towards things like cancer and other diseases, because we're doing research on all these different kind of diseases and how they affect the body. And it's amazing what we do to think, 150, when my house was built in 1867. To think you get cut on the arm, that's a problem. Like, you didn't have penicillin. Until penicillin happened, people were just dying of just nothing, really. Get a common cold, that was a problem. Anything you got was a problem. And to think now that's not even anything. You get a cut, all right, we know exactly what to do about that. Whereas 150 years ago, that's the kind of advances we've made in such a short period of time.
Yeah, it is quite incredible. Well, anyway, thanks for talking. It was really fun having you on the show and
No
hearing
problem.
about your wild pilot career and your journalism. Well, anyway, just thanks for talking.
No problem. Next time we'll talk about my career as an ice cream man when I was in high school. That was a